Book of Equanimity, Case 13, Rinzai's Blind Donkey. Attention, when Rinzai was about to pass away, he charged Sancho, "After I depart, do not let my true Dharma eye be extinguished." Sancho said, "How could I let your true Dharma eye be extinguished?" Rinzai countered, "If someone suddenly asks you about it, how will you reply?" Sancho gave a shout, and Rinzai remarked, "Who would have thought that my true Dharma eye would be extinguished on reaching this blind donkey?" So Rinzai Gigen's date of birth is unknown, but it's generally said that his teaching career was not much longer than a decade. However, he studied under Obaku from an early age. Though he modestly called himself a mountain monk, he was steeped in the Buddhist teachings and freely quoted from them. He lived in 9th century China, which was the late period of the Tang Dynasty. He died in January of 867 AD. So he's the founder, as most of us know, or all of us, of the Rinzai line, but was only recognized as founder of a school long after his death. This school of Chan Buddhism later turned out to be one of the most successful schools of Buddhism in China and Japan and the US. Sancho Enen was one of the Dharma heirs of Rinzai. His birth date, death date, and birthplace are unknown, but he became the abbot of Sansheng Temple, and he's said to have compiled the Book of Rinzai, or at least kept the notes as he studied with Rinzai and heard him talk, and which later became the Book of Rinzai, the recorded sayings of Master Rinzai. Sancho appears in case 49 and 68 of the Blue Cliff record and in the Book of Rinzai. So I wanted to talk about, Chigan Roshi asked me to give this Dharma talk, and thank you. I was preparing for a trip to New York City, but all that came to mind was to talk about spiritual interrelationship and to talk about my deepening understanding of it through my years of practice. And so this case speaks to that. So I was already 55 years old when I began going to the Zen Center of Syracuse in 1996. I sought it out after a series of dreams told me that there was something missing from my life. I don't know if I've ever told you that story, but I did. So somehow something was already working, and I was lucky enough to pay attention to it. So in the spring, I went in 1996, and then in the spring of the next year, I attended a weekend session at Ho-En-Ji, and at the end of that session, our teacher, we called her Roko-san at the time, told us that the next step was to go to DBZ for a session. So I believed it, and I registered for a 5-day summer session here in the summer of 1997. And that was led by Ada Roshi. So at that time, my career and my life, I was still working, had really centered on people with disabilities. And that was partly because I have a son I raised a son who's on the autism spectrum and also has schizoaffective disorder. So I knew from his childhood what that was. But I also had many, many friends with disabilities. So I had great respect, and my career was one of giving support. So that was important to me. And at that session with Ada Roshi, he talked every day about Jimmy Tanahashi. Every teisho was about Jimmy Tanahashi. And all I knew then was that Jimmy Tanahashi had Down syndrome. But he started filling in, talking about his life and what his life was. I remember something he said that had to do with his inner life. So Jimmy didn't speak and he used a wheelchair. So those teishos spoke really deeply to me. And I wanted to know more about this, and I was kind of naive at the time. So I just asked Ada Roshi, could I interview you about this? And he said yes. So I went for an interview in 1998, and he told me much more about it. So after that, based on what he had told me, I wrote an article and I submitted it for publication. And the reviewers wanted me to add Christian comparisons, and I didn't want to. So I didn't revise it and submit it again. But that was really important, even though it was thinking from a more rational perspective. So that effort to understand how a child with Down syndrome could fit in to what we were experiencing as we were going along this path, that was really fundamental to me. So later, I discovered that Ada Roshi and his students were also involved with people who were incarcerated, and that was also a really important part, something that was very important to me that I'd been involved in years before. And then I learned about other so-called outsiders who were included to this Sangha, like LGBTQ members of that community, people with HIV/AIDS, others who might feel excluded from many religious organizations were included here. So that was an important entry step for me. So was it coincidence that Ada Roshi spoke about that every day at my first session here? So I think this aligning between myself and him was one thread of many that helped me to start to experience spiritual interconnectedness in the Buddha's way. And I say that not because I'm special, because each one of us can think of those incidents that struck us so deeply and made us aware of something beyond. But at that time, I did rely heavily on rational mind for understanding things. And that coincidence also revealed something beyond for me. So here's the background of the story. And this is from something that's called the Daibosatsu Chronicle, which was written by Shinge Roshi in the first years of her service here as abbot. She said, quote, in 1893, Soen Shaku Roshi, abbot of Engakuji in Kamakura, Japan, was invited to address the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. He was attended by his 23-year-old student, Daisetsu Taitaro Suzuki, DT Suzuki, who translated his talk into English. She went on to say, the Dharma effect of their coming to the United States will be the creation of the Zen Studies Society in 1956, which is 70 years later about, to support DT Suzuki's scholarly work. So Soen Shaku was invited back to the U.S. in 1905, and he asked both Nyogen Shinzaki, or D.T. Suzuki, and Nyogen Shinzaki, who was one of his students, to come with him. At the end of that stay, as I understand it, Nyogen Shinzaki was told to stay here. Spoke no English, didn't know anything, but he stayed. And he was told to bring Zen practice to America when it was ripe, when the time was ripe. So he didn't begin giving lectures until 1922. That was 17 years later. And by that time, he had learned English, but even more so, he had learned American culture. And that was why he was able to be successful. So D.C. Suzuki was giving scholarly talks all over the country, and people were getting curious about Zen. But as I understand it, Nyogen Shinzaki was teaching Zen as a master. So he moved to Los Angeles in 1931, and there he met Shubin Tanahashi. She owned a laundry where he took his clothing and robes, and as I understand it, he couldn't pay to get his clothing back after she had laundered them, and she finally called him or found him. And anyways, and he said, well, I don't have the money right now. Well, through that interchange, he learned that she had a son, Jimmy, with Down syndrome, who they didn't have schooling in those days for children with disabilities. So he came to the laundry with his mother every day and sat there in the laundry while she worked. And he had the idea of trading. He would take care of Jimmy and she would do his laundry. So that's how they met. She became a Zen student, as we know, and we have many of our things right here at Daibosatsu Zendo now. And she introduced him through that to the poetry of Soen Nakagawa. So monk Nyogen in the U.S. and monk Soen in Japan established a really deep, profound spiritual correspondence. And thus began the manifestation of what Edo Roshi called the Daibosatsu Mandala. Soen Roshi named it in one of his paintings, a diagram of spiritual interrelationship. So I can't show you the painting, it's in this book and it's too small, but I'll describe a little bit about it. So in 1996, Edo Shimano, Kazuaki Tanahashi, and at that time Roko Sherry Shayat published a book called Endless Vow, The Zen Path of Soen Nakagawa. And that the introduction to this book tells this story in depth in a very profound way, so anyone who doesn't have it, get it. It's so wonderful. So here's from the introduction by Edo Roshi. Endless Vow, the Zen Path of Soen Nakagawa, is an invitation to enter a mandala, not a 2- or 3-dimensional one, but a mandala of what Soen Roshi used to call endless dimension universal life. So I'm going to read a little bit from the introduction. It relates to the spiritual interrelationship. So Soen Roshi by that time knew Edo Roshi because of Nyogen Shinzaki. By the time of the 1960s and early 1970s. And he, as Edo Roshi and his students decided to open a zendo here, Soen Roshi used to say, well, it's my chanting of Namu Daibosa from Japan, my continuous chanting, that's making this all possible. So Soen Roshi, or Edo Roshi said, when Soen Roshi attributed its success to cosmic forces that he had set in motion, it seemed an irritatingly romantic view. I felt he ignored the muddy, painful world of dust and avoided getting his hands dirty with the hard work. So Edo Roshi had to start dealing with labor unions, banks, prime rates, the gasoline shortage, architects, and fundraising, all of these in a new language, in a new country. And that's what he did. So he was really in the dust. And he had good help from people, especially he mentioned William Johnstone. So Edo Roshi says, Soen Roshi seemed to hold himself aloof from such matters, often asking his students to take care of practical affairs. Then something happened to change his view. He read this letter that he had read many, many other times, and it contained a painting, which you can't see, but you can get the book, and of a mandala. He called it a spiritual interrelationship mandala. And this was sent to Nyogen Sensei in 1938. So Edo Roshi was writing this book, and he started looking at this painting again. And here's what it contained. It contained a mandala, and inside the outer circle he drew a mountain. And then above the mountain is another circle with a monk sitting in the center like Vairocana Buddha. And in the middle is the character Shinkyo, and at the bottom he wrote Los Angeles, which is where Nyogen Sensei was. At the top he put names of places important to him, and then Edo Roshi spotted the name of of Edo Roshi's birthplace in the corner of the painting. How would he have known? When he wrote this, when he painted that, Edo Roshi was like 6 years old, never had met each other, never anything. So Edo Roshi started thinking, he said, I was a 6-year-old boy living with my family in Nakano. It was in Nakano, Arai, where I first heard the Heart Sutra and where I had my first taste of the Dharma. Of course, Soen Roshi and I had never met, and at that time I did not know anything about a Daibosatsu mandala. Now, more than half a century later and on another continent, I find myself in the midst of this Daibosatsu mandala. Though I may never know why he wrote Nakano Arai on the top of the mandala or what significance it had to him, it seems that I am part of the Daibosatsu mandala and cannot escape from it. So our chanting of Namu Dai Bo Sa is meant to be for past, present, and future generations. I must confess that since reading this letter, I've had to rethink my criticism of his mystical claims for founding the monastery in the Catskills with the chanting of Namu Dai Bo Sa. I now realize that his actions cannot be understood from the ordinary rational viewpoint. Soen Roshi must be perceived from the vista of the cosmos, where the collective unconscious and the everyday world are not separate, and where the non-rational universe is continually manifesting itself in worldly events through what I call Dharma arrangements. So that's a little of the story. He went on to say later, this Daibosatsu mandala consists of innumerable Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and ancestors from both the East and the West who played a role in the formation of a Dharma phenomenon in the land of liberty. There are at least 4 generations that I can name as part of the mandala. This was Edo Roshi in 1996. The first generation was that of Soen Shaku and Genpo Roshi. The second includes Nyogen Senzaki, Soen Roshi, Shuben Tanahashi, Chester Carlson, and others. The third is my generation. The fourth is the current Sangha, perhaps including those who are reading this now. So what generation are we? We are in that generation. So in July 4th, 1994, on the last day of anniversary session, there was a dedication of the Kaisando here. Edo Roshi said, quote, "I feel it is inappropriate for me to consider myself the founder of Daibosatsu Zendo, not because I am still alive, but because I know what a karmic net is. Therefore, it is most appropriate, at least for now, to name the following people as the founders of Daibosatsu Zendo Kongoji. Soen Nakagawa Roshi, respectfully invited founder. Nyogen Senzaki, karmic founder. Chester Carlson, financial benefactor. Jimmy Tanahashi, karmic benefactor. Hakuin Yasutani Roshi, spiritual benefactor. Dr. D.T. Suzuki, scholarly benefactor. And William Johnstone, managerial benefactor." So, of course, I noticed Jimmy Tanahashi included in that auspicious lineup. So I remember that in that interview, Edo Roshi was telling me that Nyogen Senzaki used to push Jimmy in his wheelchair around Los Angeles streets. And he would chant Shujo Muhen Se Gando over and over. And so even though Jimmy couldn't speak for much of his life, he learned that line and he chanted it with Nyogen Senzaki, at least according to Edo Roshi. And later, much later, actually, Edo Roshi met him once when he was living elsewhere. He wasn't living with his mother anymore. And he saw a monk, and he, Shujo Muhen Se Gondo. So it was very important to him. He also told me, Edo Roshi did, about no seeing, no hearing, no smelling, no knowing, and he placed Jimmy Tanahashi in that. He situated him in that phrase as one who could have deep spiritual attainment regardless of how he seemed to others. So that was revelatory to me. The Christian scholarly works that I had read named a number of roles that people with disabilities play in culture. One has to do with the sins of the parents. One has to do with, was called the holy fool, not deeply spiritually attained, but other things, playing roles for our society. But Edo Roshi was getting at something entirely different. So he also told me that he and some DBZ students visited the Tanahashi grave plot after Shuben Tanahashi died in 1993. And they were dismayed to find out there was no marker for Jimmy's ashes. So they paid their respects and tried to learn why. And it was because of shame. Even many cultures at the time were so ashamed that they wouldn't acknowledge a child with a disability. So they went home, but he later sent Yayoi, his student at the time, back to Los Angeles, or maybe she was going there, and he asked her to bring some of the soil from the grave plot of the family, of the Tanahashi family, back to the U.S. with him, back to DBZ with her. And he wanted to, because he wanted to honor Jimmy properly here. So she did so. And you can find a Jizo statue at the top of Sangomedo, next to the stupa of Soen Roshi, with Jimmy Tanahashi's plaque on it. So that was done before I knew him, but it had been done. So again, so going back to the koan, Rinzai's Blind Donkey, in which Rinzai and Sansho talk about Rinzai's true Dharma eye. Can it ever be extinguished? It's with us, in us today, and has been through immeasurable kalpas. I see it as running through our interconnectedness today, as well as a river running from the past in which we're immersed. True Dharma I could seem to be extinguished, however, if we think that it's something solid, something to be sought after or caught or clung to. It flows. And the same could be said of the mandala that Edo Roshi described. It lives when we give ourselves to its changing form, which is what we're doing right here. When we understand that it has no form, much less a name. So there's another way in which this case speaks to me, and that has to do with his words, this blind donkey. Again, this is a high praise for Sancho. And I think the blindness of which he speaks can be likened to no seeing, no knowing, no limitations. Again, in this view, what we think of as disabling in ordinary life becomes a metaphor for supreme understanding, because it's beyond limitations, beyond seeing, knowing. It's not in the knowing. So that's what I encountered with my interview with Edo Roshi, but I can't say that I understood it very well then. I was starting to understand it. So I would like to just introduce you a little bit more to Soen Roshi, since I'm up here. So this is the kind of person he was. He wrote a journal. He wrote journals all his life, and in 1949, he wrote during Rohatsu Sesshin. He was in Japan at his monastery. Under the ancient stupa of Hakuin in the great Zendo, 25 of us sat knee to knee. The billowing Dharma ocean grew calm in this period of 8 days compressed into one. For the first time in a long time, I served as Chikijitsu. Tears kept welling up in my eyes with the joy of interconnected life and the heartbeat of the true Dharma. In the land of joy and the city of angels, Los Angeles, also there will be practitioners sitting like mountains facing the walls. Clappers are struck, the bell is rung, Buddhas and bodhisattvas as numerous as the sand of the Ganges emerge from the 10 directions. And I also wanted to read a poem. He was such a poet that he wrote in April of 1949 as he was coming on a ship to the United States. Arriving at the other shore, the great round mirror of the boundless ocean has disappeared in the dark blue night. This boat is now speeding toward the east at 21 knots per hour at a north latitude of 130 degrees, bound for a country of science, for a country of atomic bombs. The General Gordon is a huge white dragon chewing its way through the cresting waves of eternal eon samsara and shooting 7-hued rainbows across the dome of the sky. Assembled on the deck are a Jewish painter, a Canadian journalist, a Polish missionary, and a Japanese physicist. All share a bowl of tea served by this wandering monk. Do you or do you not know? Hidden in this bowl of tea is a secret, more secret than all of atomic science. All things are born of interrelated conditions. Therefore, not a thing has a separate identity. Because there is no separate identity, this one bowl can contain even more than the Pacific Ocean. Not coming, not going, not attaining, thus in the end empty. In this way, even if I thoroughly penetrate into the emptiness of the 3 billion great worlds, still there is more emptiness to fathom. And tomorrow morning, I will arrive at the other shore, San Francisco. So that's Soen Roshi. A little bit of him. So interrelationship. I hear it when we chant so full-throatedly together in the mornings and at meals. I hear it, I see it when we are walking in kinhin and being careful to join the line in order if we leave it. I see it in everything that we do here. And I felt it, but I had no way to describe it ever since I began studying with Shinge Roshi, maybe before that, but for sure then. So now, after these 28 years of practice, I can also see what I could not see back then. I relied heavily then on proofs that people with disabilities, people with various characteristics, like incarceration or whatever, did belong equally to our path and were both ministered to and contributors to our Sangha. So that was something I relied on and thought out. And so now, I think I see more. In the Diamond Sutra, Buddha tells us, wherever there are material characteristics, there's delusion. But whoever understands that all characteristics are in fact no characteristics sees the Tathagata. So in how many ways can we leave rational mind behind and enter the state of knowing, not knowing? As Soen Roshi said, again, all things are born of interrelated conditions. Therefore, not a thing has a separate identity. Because there is no separate identity, this one bowl can contain even more than the Pacific Ocean. So let us open every moment of the rest of this long one day.